Chapter 9. A New Humiliation Part 2. The opening of the infamous abandoned tower was surprisingly degraded, like how Harry would have assumed most castle doorways would look after over 1,000 years of use. He stepped through the haphazard planks affixed to the frame onto the first of the rickety stones that made him consider returning to his nice, warm and safe Gryffindor tower. However, he was convinced there would be something here, a stash of letters from Sirius Black, in Gaara's desk, a cache of deadly weapons, in Gaara's pouch under his bed, explosives, in the same pouch, illegal research, technically not illegal, or simply a clue to his origins. What he found, after the harrowing climb up the wobbly steps, was any empty and drafty room. There were rotten remnants of furniture, but there were no signs of anything being left over by a nefarious Slytherin. Though, Harry noticed as he stepped across the smaller tower, the main room of the structure was not nearly as loose or damaged as he had been led to believe. It was damaged, the hole in the wall testament to that fact, but overall he didn't think it felt very unsafe at all, unlike the steps leading to it. Grumbling, after half an hour of combing through everything in the tower, he descended back down the steps and went back to the common room to continue his surveillance of Gaara and a number of other people before Hermione could badger him into getting started on his homework. At which point he would ignore his homework for another full day and mess around with Ron for a while. Hermione would huff and join in after a while anyway. He also spent a little time on his own, when he could get away, to practice his Patronus. He knew that even if he were to succeed on his own, without a Dementor or even a Boggart to use it against, it was little better than a fancy light spell. Still, it at least made him feel like he was doing something consequential. Gaara, stop playing knife games during the lesson, you're marking the desk. Professor Sprout said with a quiet sigh, swiftly moving back onto topic. It was a rather dull class this week since they were dealing with a new batch of puffapods in greenhouse number 7. Gaara looked up at his name being called, thought for a second, and deposited the knife back into his pocket and resumed listening half-heartedly to the lecture on dealing with the quite explosive plants. Draco hadn't even noticed, so used to Gaara's dangerous antics by now. After class let out, 15 minutes early since the Hufflepuff 2 workstations over from Gaara and Draco's had dropped his seeds and covered the floor with blooming flowers. Sprout had huffed and said that she was fed up with cleaning up puffapod flowers this week. Draco had loudly postulated that it had probably been Weasley that had the accident last time, him or Longbottom. Since Herbology had been the last lesson that Wednesday, the students scattered once they were let out. Draco noticed Gaara was flagging behind him, one of the redhead's favorite tactics for ditching him after classes. Before Gaara could dash away with the crowd covering his escape, Draco caught hold of his baggy robe sleeve and pulled him along to the castle's entrance. They had a chore to do and Gaara wasn't weaseling out of it. Again. Draco had already written most of Gaara's Christmas thank you notes and he was determined that the mannerless cur wouldn't leave all of it to Draco. When they were back to their room, Draco sat Gaara down at his desk and told him he was going to finish this today. Gaara scowled and thought about escape methods, like knocking Draco out or setting something on fire. He eventually resigned himself to writing out the notes, accepting that it probably was the polite thing to do since he hadn't sent out any gifts to the people who had sent him presents, as he understood the tradition went. Fortunately, his penmanship was quick and efficient, and he was well on his way within the hour, much to Draco's appreciation and relief. Draco was doing yet more homework as Gaara worked, the blonde former dilettante's grades having skyrocketed since his first encounter with his roommate. Soon, he started to chit the chat with his friend. You said your brother and sister were older than you. How old are they? Draco was wondering if they were still in school in Gaara's home country or if they had jobs. Gaara didn't turn to look at him, nor did he pause in his writing. His sand drifted into the words. Kankuro was 16 and Tumrai was 17, I think. You think? We didn't start celebrating birthdays until recently. Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask, along with 100 other things, when is your birthday? The 19th of January, I think. What? Draco was incredulous. That was only a week away. But more than that, this meant that despite being a good deal shorter than him, Gaara was in fact the older of the pair. Needless to say, Draco didn't see fit to mention Gaara's stunted growth in relation to his age. As I said, I've only just started keeping track. I'm pretty sure it's the 19th. We have to have a party, Draco said, already formulating in his head what he could put together in such little time. Obviously organizing something at the mansion was out of the question, not nearly enough time to send out formal invitations and get permission to leave the school for a night. What? Why? This finally got Gaara's attention away from the growing stack of thank you notes, his mind already dreading the thought of another Malfoy event like the Christmas celebration. Draco sat back in his chair and started jotting down notes, now ignoring Gaara's growing panic, as he tried to formulate this plan. He ran into a bit of a roadblock when he remembered that he was one of 2 students at the school that would actually come to a party honoring Gaara, and even his parents who had taken something of a shine to the boy wouldn't go to a party without some political reason. On a guest list he had in his head, the only names he could think of were him, Luna, and a teacher who appeared to favor Gaara. Worse yet, he couldn't hold the party in the Slytherin quarters because of the lack of Slytherin support and the outsiders who wouldn't be allowed to come in. Gaara sighed and went back to his notes. He knew he had no say in this frivolity, and if he was lucky he would be able to skip the party altogether. But since when was he lucky? After some more scheming and writing notes, Draco resumed his previous line of enquiry, not allowing himself to become distracted now that he had a chance to learn a little about Gaara. So, your brother and your sister are still in school, back in your home country, Draco concluded. Unless they finished schooling at 16 like some other institutions did. Gaara relaxed a little now that they were back to a comfortable subject. No, they both finished when Tumrai was 12 and Kankuro was 11. What? How did they finish school when they were so young? Draco couldn't imagine it. His schooling had only really begun at that age. The previous education he had received was primarily tutorial-based. They were very fast studies. Our culture believes in vocational learning. We all graduated, but we would then learn on our jobs. You all graduated. Do you mean that you finished school in your own country? Yes. I finished at the same time as my siblings. We all worked together. What on earth were you doing? You must have been. He worked out the difference, what? 9, 10. 9, I think. And you started working when you were that old? Yes. We have a very different culture to yours. Although, I finished very early. I have certain gifts that helped me to advance. Gaara felt a little ill at the prospect of referring to Shukaku as a gift. The demon in him was a gift in the same way that a burning bag of dog poop on one's stoop could be called one. But what exactly did you do, you, your brother and a little girl? Gaara thought for a moment on how best to describe his occupation. Draco knew he was a warrior already, but to admit being one from the age of 9. That might invite uncomfortable questions like when/if he had ever killed. Which led to any number of worse questions. We took jobs, with the help of an instructor, which ranged from transporting important documents to guarding places or people. The latter was a rare occasion and usually signaled that his father had wanted the subject dead. So it was a bit like a shared apprenticeship, Draco concluded. But I still think it's positively backwards to finish school when you're 9 and then start working. How can they possibly teach you everything you need to know by then? It is a harder place. We learn what we need to know, and learn the rest in the field. Or you died. Sounds positively barbaric, if you ask me. Where in the world is your home, exactly? Sounds like it's in the Middle Ages. I don't quite know. I got sent here, as punishment for his sins, unexpectedly. This finally grabbed Draco's full and utmost attention. Wait, what? What do you mean you were sent here? Someone used a technique to send me here. I don't know how to return. Draco was shocked by the fact that Gaara had never seen fit to share that rather important piece of information. Did Dumbledore or Lupin know about this? And then it clicked, a little later than Draco would have been proud to admit. The research Gaara did, the secret research that he did outside of class. The fact that Gaara had been doing covert reading since he had arrived had just been a factor of his abundant eccentricity and not something to pay any particular mind to. So someone sent you to a foreign country using magic, and you haven't told anyone? No other than the mass murderer and his friend. Gaara considered telling Draco about coming from another world, but he hadn't really intended to tell the boy this much and he didn't want to overwhelm him. Plus Draco was growing to be quite inquisitive, so he would let his roommate ruminate over the new information for a while. Why haven't you asked for help? I'm sure Professor Lupin, or even Professor Dumbledore could help you find your way home or undo the magic that sent you here. I didn't want to. Draco's hand met his forehead, utterly confounded by his brainy friend's dense personality. Another rainy Saturday in January, the Golden Trio sat having a heated debate that for once was instigated by Hermione herself, usually the proverbial peacemaker in their group. She had decided that enough was enough and that she, needed to address Harry's recent anger issues. Of course, since she phrased her well-meaning concerns thoughtfully and with a clinical objectivity, Harry reacted by biting her head off. Kirill tried to kill me in our first year, with Voldemort on the back of his head, he continued his rant, Ron flinching noticeably more than Hermione at you-know-whose name. Then there was Lockhart trying to wipe my brains when I was trying to rescue Ginny from Voldemort again, who almost did kill me that time. With a bloody great big snake. Now I've got Sirius Black, my godfather, out for blood, and Malfoy teaming up with that psychopath Gaara. Hermione interjected before Harry could build up any more steam. Well, I don't know about any of them, which she most certainly did, but Gaara hasn't done anything wrong, really, has he? What about when he attacked Harry? Ron shouted. Harry struck first. Hermione rebutted. No, I didn't. No, he didn't. Yes, you did. Gaara had just shoved me with his sand. Exactly. Ron bled. He only did that because I tried to give him a hug. Hermione said, still trying to spread reason. You what? You tried to hug him? Harry was rightfully incredulous. Even Hermione looked a little embarrassed in hindsight. Well, he was a new and he was so withdrawn. He reminded me of some of the special needs students at my old primary. So you thought you would cuddle him? Ron didn't know whether to find this funny or give in to the deep sense of jealous fury within him that he wouldn't have been able to make sense of until an eventful Christmas ball the following year. Hermione for her part was fully embarrassed by this point, seeing that her attempt to hug a strange teenager had been naive, to put it mildly. My point is, she said forcefully, trying to set that silly moment of hers firmly in the past, is that Gaara wasn't to blame and that his fighting you was just the result of a misunderstanding. What about him trying to kill Snape? Harry argued back. Well, you can hardly blame him there, it's not like no one else has thought about it. Ron said, his hand sneaking to the side to find the nearly empty box of Bertibots he'd been emptying for Harry all afternoon. Snape did antagonize him, Hermione said. Well, he's still a prat, Harry concluded, whether or not he ceded to his bookworm friend's point about Gaara. But Sirius Black is still out there looking for a way to get to me. Maybe, but that doesn't mean that you should go out looking for him, Harry. I mean, he is a convicted murderer. You don't honestly think you could fight him, do you? Ron, for a change, was speechless as he awaited Harry's answer. Well, of course I don't know, maybe. Who knows, but if I meet him I will do what my father should have done when he first met that dark base. Harry. Murderers and betrayals aside, Hermione wouldn't abide swearing. Sulking a little from being out-argued, Harry stayed quiet as Hermione started on about some rare gossip about a Hufflepuff 7th year who was in trouble. As she continued on about how silly the girl was and about the ramifications of it all, he thought back to the best part of his otherwise morose winter break. He had spoken to Lupin a few times in passing since the beginning of the school year. The surprisingly awkward man had seemed to avoid him up to that point, but Harry had persevered and managed to corner Lupin using the map. He had gotten Remus talking eventually after a fair amount of pestering, about his parents and about their group of friends. It visibly pained the professor to talk about not only James and Lily, but about Peter and Sirius also. Harry asked how angry he was at Sirius, but he had been woefully disappointed by the answer he had received. I was angry. I was really angry, for a long time. Once or twice, when it got really bad, when I got really bad, I thought about breaking into Azkaban by myself and doing something. I don't even know what I would have done had I managed to confront Sirius, but I imagine it would have ended with both of us dead. After a few years had passed, I came to a new understanding, Harry. I hated Sirius still, but it was ludicrous. There I was hating everything about him. I refused to use his name, I just referred to him by his hated surname, but then I realized that by hating him and denying him, I was further destroying what I had lost. I don't understand, Harry said, wondering where this digression was heading. Lupin laughed at that. No, I don't suppose you do. I'm not explaining myself very clearly. Am I hardly an admirable quality in a professor, I fear? My point, Harry, was that I have so many happy memories of your parents, and Peter, and of Sirius too, and that by blocking out Sirius, I lost a large part of those happy memories. And those were all I had for a long time, for one reason or another. Lupin was telling the truth, something he regrettably was unable to do a large amount of the time when Harry was concerned. He had lobbied for telling Harry everything from the start, wanting to build bridges between the boy and his godfather from the moment they met, but oddly Sirius had been the voice of reason. He had argued that there was no proof that he was innocent, and any words to the contrary from one of his old school friends would simply leave them with no tangible link to Harry. "But Professor, I don't have any memories." Thanks to him and to Voldemort, Lupin was ashamed to admit he flinched a little, "so I don't think I can forgive him or not hate him every bit as much as he deserves." "No, I suppose not," the older man sighed. "No matter how much I cherish the memories I have from school, I don't know that I can ever forgive your parents' killer either. Pettigrew would pay, that was for sure. Now, enough of all of this dark talk," Lupin said, forcing down his own dark impulses for the impressionable youth's benefit. "I have some rather tasty cakes from the kitchens, and I might even have a few photos of your parents you might like to see." He would have to have some copies made up of them since he couldn't bring himself to part with the precious few pictures he had of his friends, even for Harry. "That sounds nice," Harry had said, eager for any more morsels of experience he might garner about his mum and dad. "And cake?" Cake was good too. It was Monday and Slytherin had only a couple of weeks left until their scheduled rematch against the Gryffindors, so tensions were high and the pressure on Draco as Seeker was at an all-time high. He contented himself with the knowledge that Potter was receiving even more from his Quidditch-obsessed house. "Good morning, Draco." Luna had a very disconcerting way of appearing when people least expected her, which was sadly all of the time. Nonetheless, Draco wasn't about to snub a pureblood who was, unaccountably, a friend of a friend. "Good morning, Luna." Draco thought his obligation was fulfilled and walked briskly away, heading in the general direction of the Quidditch field since his practice was supposed to start in 20 minutes. "Do you have any plans for Gaara's birthday yet?" Luna asked, again surprising Draco as she spoke from his blind spot. "Where did you hear about that?" It wasn't as if Draco had been going around spreading the news. "He told me about it." Her shorter legs kept pace admirably with Draco's stride. "Wait, when did Gaara tell you about his birthday?" His gait had almost faltered, but instead it just slowed to regular walking speed since he obviously wasn't going to lose her. "Oh, a couple of months ago, I think. I hadn't known him for very long, so I asked him when it was." The simplicity of it stung a bit. For the umpteenth time, his truly British neuroses stood in the way of discovery. Thinking for a second, Draco eventually overcame his incredulity and booted up again. Yes, I was thinking about booking one of the back rooms in the Hogshead in Hogsmeade. Gaara will need a teacher to accompany him since he doesn't have permission from any parents, so we would invite Professor Lupin. That's all really." Needless to say, Draco hadn't gotten very far in his party plans. He apparently didn't have his mother's flair for the task. "That sounds lovely, I think Gaara will like that very much. Hopefully, with Professor Lupin there as well, they won't mind me going either." "Pardon? I'm only a second year, so I'm not allowed to go to Hogsmeade yet. And it's a Wednesday, so I think I don't know if they will let me come." Draco wanted to slap himself for the obvious oversight. "Of course, right, yes. I'm sure Lupin will be able to swing it. Just to be safe, though, try to clear it with Professor Flitwick first. Tell him that it is the first birthday Gaara's celebrating away from his family. A little guilt trip couldn't hurt." "Are you going to ask Professor Snape for Gaara?" "No. Everyone in Slytherin knows better than to mention Gaara's name to Snape. He'll never know about any of it. Lupin will go straight to Dumbledore, I expect. It's quite curious, that Snape seems to hate Gaara so much. Do you know why? No one is quite sure, Draco said, recalling a number of fruitless conversations, Gaara least of all. One of the upper years said it was probably because Snape's been in a particularly bad mood this year for some reason and that Gaara just got caught in the crosshairs. Plus Gaara can be very frustrating. I did notice a strong concentration of rackspurts around his head this year, Professor Snape's I mean, but they have been stirred up into a frenzy ever since the Dementors surrounded the school this summer, so I didn't think much of it. Luna seemed even more quizzical than she usually did as she mulled over this connection. Draco almost fell into the trap of asking what rackspurts were, but remembered in time what he had heard of Luna Looney Lovergood. Namely, she believed in a number of nonsensical and imaginary creatures. Not wanting to be drawn into either a pointless debate or some ridiculous explanation, he let it drop, and soon enough he had arrived at the Quidditch field. While Luna seemed to play by different general rules than the rest of humanity, even she wasn't likely to follow him into the boys' changing room. In place of a farewell, Luna said, "I'm glad Gaara is friends with you. He has sad eyes and I think you're helping him. He's a nice person and you are too, even if you both don't realize it." Then she turned on her heels and began skipping back up the corridor they had just walked down. Draco didn't bother shouting anything after her, instead thinking over what she had said. It had been strange, as most things she said were, but also oddly insightful. Still, for a pureblood she was far too scatty and clingy, but at least her interests or affections weren't directed at him. Gaara had the blissful virtue of obliviousness. The redhead in question, who had come to hope that Draco had dropped the subject of his birthday celebrations after his total lack of interest and other friends became apparent, was on one of his all too frequent trips through the woods to see Sirius. Gaara longed for the warm summer days where Sirius could hunt and scavenge for his own food instead of having it supplied via surly ninja. Well, there was also the fact that Gaara hated and would always hate the snow and all cold weather. Sirius was in the shack as he always was, acting like a dog in the most inappropriate way when Gaara walked in. In short order, Padfoot transformed back into Sirius, presumably so that he could actively give Gaara the silent treatment. What the immature escaped convict always failed to appreciate was that Gaara was perfectly happy sitting in silence with his friends, a very recent pluralism. After 30 minutes, in which Sirius had edged over, snatched the sack that Gaara had set down between them, and begun to devour the food that Gaara had brought with him, Sirius finally cracked and shouted, "I can't believe you gave away the broom." Gaara sighed and continued stared at him long and hard, having explained his actions half a dozen times since Sirius found out. "You couldn't have given it to a Gryffindor, you had to give it to a bloody Slytherin seeker." Having gone through this enough times now, Gaara knew his participation was not required, so he let Sirius continue monologuing until he ran out of breath. Of course, the diatribe included liberal uses of his alias Lily, and a couple of veiled insults at his placement in Slytherin. Things took a different turn before Sirius could tire himself out when his angry rant about the House of Snakes turned to a self-pitying one about the upcoming rematch between Gryffindor and Slytherin and how Sirius wasn't going to be able to go and watch. He whined and sulked and bemoaned his poor luck, not to be able to freely go and see his godson beat Slytherin properly. He wouldn't even be able to cheer Harry on, which was so unfair since Harry was already disadvantaged by Malfoy's brat having a state-of-the-art broom. Gaara wanted to ignore Sirius' blatant attempts at manipulation, but he knew that would only lead to the man going on forever. God forbid Draco won the match. Fine. I'll help you sneak in. It was much harder to sneak anything past the Dementors since their numbers had been bolstered, so he would need to think of something especially clever, and preferably uncomfortable for the immature mutt. Predictably, the grown man's mood perked right up in a flash and he was back to his old self, moving straight on to a new subject. Gaara thought, as he constantly did, about causing him some physical harm but decided not to since the matter was closed and he didn't want the man-child becoming grumpy again. So, you know how I've been following that strange smell in the forest lately? Sirius asked. Gaara did not, since he routinely tuned out the man-forward/dog's talk of scents and other animalistic exploits. Some of it struck too close to home. When Gaara failed to nod or answer, he continued regardless, I finally caught up to it and you'll never guess what I found. It was a bloody great big dog, with 3 heads. Gaara paused in turning the sausages on a spit over the fire, and looked at Sirius. I know. 3 heads. The worst part is that when I told Mooney about it, he said he already knew it was there. One of Hagrid's old pets or something, apparently. Sirius was so excited it was hard to keep the grin off of Gaara's face. He did wonder why Lupin was spending so much time in the forest on his own, but chalked it up to taking frequent strolls on his own, as he liked to do. It has to be at least twice the size of the shack, which Fluffy wasn't, and was fiercely territorial when I met it, but I was able to get it to submit easily enough. Somehow Gaara doubted that Fluffy had been anything but annoyingly friendly to a strange dog. A lot of his visits were whirlwind drop-offs when he was mostly stopping by to give Sirius some food or clean drinking water, but that night Gaara spent hours there, being talked at by the man who had gone 12 years without a friendly ear to talk off. Gaara saw Sirius at least once a week, and he knew that Remus went to visit twice as often as that, which would have more than fulfilled Gaara's quota for social interaction if he were the one stuck out in the crumbling shack in the dead of winter. However, Sirius, despite the time he spent in abject loneliness, was fundamentally a social creature, and Gaara could see that he wanted to be around people more. It helped that Sirius wasn't at all subtle about it, further evidenced by his repeating the offer he had made some time ago to take Gaara in once he was free and cleared of all charges. Gaara was thankful, but he didn't know if either of them would survive living in close proximity again. When Sirius had been looking after his wounded body in the summer, Gaara had been too injured to beat him to death. When the morning of the 19th dawned, Gaara was dreading what his friend might have planned for him, but even after Draco had woken up he gave no recognition of the date other than that it was a Wednesday. Thankful but no less suspicious, Gaara waited all day for an utterance of happy birthday or some such frivolity. Wednesday's classes ended as they always did, with Gaara slowly ambling out of one of the Herbology greenhouses, trying not to touch any of the dangerous-looking, or sounding, plants that reminded him of his brother's own toxic greenhouse. Each and every time Gaara found himself in that class surrounded by the myriad of flora, he unerringly asked himself what's wrong with a simple cactus garden. By this point in the day, after having been with Draco for hours, and having seen Lupin and Luna in Dada and the Great Hall respectively, he still hadn't gotten so much as a mention of the day, so he thought he might be spared the indignity. As Draco and he were approaching the dungeons they ran into Professor Lupin, looking rather more angry than either was used to seeing from the placid teacher. Gaara, you need to follow me, he said, addressing only the redhead without the barest hint of joviality in his voice. Now, what is this about, sir? Draco asked, his impetuous disregard for the man's authority continuing even still. This doesn't concern you, Draco, the headmaster needs to talk to Gaara. Lupin turned and walked away back up the stairs without checking if Gaara would follow. The bewildered foreigner did indeed follow his trusted friend and teacher up the steps, wondering all the while what this could be about. He had been pretty good recently, and the things he had done he had been pretty good about hiding. Maybe they had finally worked out that he was killing the Dementors, or that he had been sneaking out of the grounds regularly since the year began. Or, well, there were certainly more than a couple of reasons for calling him to see the principal, but he didn't think they actually knew about any of them. Maybe he was getting sloppy, but then, in his mind, his gruesome and bloody murders back in his village had been sophisticated assassinations. Gaara had never been as underhand or subtle as he'd like to believe, according to his siblings. The journey from the lowest quarters to one of the highest towers of Hogwarts had been entirely silent until Lupin spoke the Griffin statue's facile password and started on the spiral staircase to the headmaster's office. Gaara was in his mind trying to think of a number of strategies centering on denial, evasion, or, if need be, escape. If they had, by some dint of magic or miracle, been clued in on what Gaara was or what he was doing, he would have to clear the way and escape from the tower somehow. Easier said than done when all he had in his pocket was a handful of sand for talking. Just as his hand was trailing towards the pocket where he carried the one kunai he felt he could reasonably conceal on his person, the heavy wooden door swung open. Surprise! Chorused Luna, Draco, Dumbledore, and Lupin behind him, sending his nerves into overdrive, and he performed a very Shinobi-like flinch instead of throwing the knife at the person directly in front of him. Though, considering that person happened to be Draco, the likely mastermind of this ruse, he would have considered it justifiable homicide. His eye twitching with pent-up anger, he allowed himself to be guided into the well-endowed office by the smirking Lupin. "I hope you don't mind, but the surprise part of this evening was my brainchild," Lupin muttered, snickering all the while. "Happy birthday!" Draco cheered, followed in short course by the other blonde and Dumbledore and Lupin. The withheld stress sagged off of Gaara's put-upon shoulders, and he was ushered into the office, happily noting that at least they hadn't covered the place in gaudy decorations or commissioned some hideously sweet cake. "I know it's not exactly orthodox, but since I have permission from Ms. Lovergood's father, and Professor Lupin is willing to take responsibility for Gaara because of his unique circumstances, I couldn't see any reason to deny Draco's request to hold a birthday party off of school property," Albus said with a wide smile to all present. Of course, none of that was true. It was entirely against the rules, but since he did have permissions and a responsible teacher accompanying them all, and since Lucius had covertly threatened to start up trouble with the other governors again this year, he had agreed. He had been a little wary of sending 3 children out with only one minder when there was a mass murderer roaming the area, but if they did nothing else, the presence of the Dementors would ensure a short outing would be as safe as possible. Part of Albus was indignant at the manipulation, especially since it had blatantly come from the 14-year-old Malfoy. However, like most of the changes this year, he saw it as a positive step on Draco's part, to be using his irrevocable Slytherin tendencies for someone else's benefit. While he wouldn't deny the precedent amongst the snakes towards the dark end of the moral spectrum, he did not buy into the prejudice that all of them were Dark Lords in the making, or Death Eaters in training. They just needed that extra bit of encouragement towards the light. Hence his enthusiastic backing of Gaara, despite all of the associated troubles. Gaara was wondering what Dumbledore had meant when he mentioned leaving the school. He would have felt dread at the thought of being dragged to some stuffy function at the Malfoy Manor, but he knew without a shadow of a doubt that Draco wouldn't let him near his parents without fixing his uniform. Gaara's top button was undone, his tie was loose, his shirt was untucked, and if Draco shouted Malfoy Manor in the flue they were lighting, he would undo his fly just to mess with the Malfoys. Instead, to his moderate relief, Draco announced that they would all be going to the Hogshead pub in Hogsmeade. The blonde went first, followed closely by Luna, who looked about as lively and cheerful as Gaara had ever seen her, and last went Lupin with Gaara, holding tightly onto him so that they would not be separated in the flue network. The landing was not as bumpy as the last time Gaara used a fireplace to travel, but he would never understand the complacency of the average witch or wizard who were willing to abide with these ridiculous modes of travel. Surely someone could have thought of something in the long and illustrious line of magic in this world. When he regained his senses, he found himself in the exact setting he did not want to be in, namely he was in a private room in the Hogshead and there was a banner with his name and celebratory references to his birthday. There were a load of balloons, there were a few birthday hats on the tables along with drinks and party foods. It was ludicrous, especially considering that there were 4 of them in the room and one of them was a grown man. Gaara covertly asked Draco why they were at the pub, a setting that surely would have caused no small amount of trouble to organize, but Draco said that they couldn't possibly celebrate properly in the school. What the rich boy didn't say was that he would have liked to hire out a much nicer venue for Gaara, but his resources and time were limited. No matter the small number, everyone, except the grumpy birthday boy, had a wonderful night, all swiftly taking their places around the table and telling funny stories, often including and ridiculing Gaara. For his part, the redhead stayed to the side, repeatedly getting pulled back towards the joviality when he strayed too close to the door. It was only as the clock struck 9:30 that Lupin conspicuously let him wander to the exit. Gaara figured the man had taken mercy on the recluse and was letting him go early without interrupting the otherwise surprisingly rowdy party. What he found outside was not what he had been expecting. Next to the door, sat Padfoot with a wagging tail and a gift crudely wrapped in old newspaper. He knelt down, knowing that the convict couldn't risk transforming near the village anymore, and took the slobbery gift from Sirius. He would have felt a tug at his heart, were it not for the fact that when he unwrapped the newspaper he found a dead rabbit and a small note saying, "Lily, you can give this one to the Slytherin too, if you want." Padfoot. Grimacing at the thing, he gently flicked Padfoot's nose, ceasing the amused tail wagging momentarily until he tossed the rabbit back for Sirius to run and catch in his jaws. The dogman would undoubtedly have more use for the thing than Gaara, or Draco, for that matter. Sirius came back and dropped the rabbit on Gaara's feet, silently requesting a game of catch. Gaara patiently waited for Sirius to drop his ears, stoop down and take the rabbit back off of his shoes, not willing to indulge in a game of catch the dead rabbit just now. Draco poked his head out of the door into the cold night just as Gaara was kneeling down in front of Padfoot. Come back in, Gaara, he cut himself off when he saw the improbable sight of his stoic, perhaps homicidal, friend, kneeling down in the cold, patting a ripe-smelling, stray dog on the head. "And don't forget to wash your hands." His sneer towards Padfoot earned him a fierce growl from the large dog, which caused the pompous blonde to duck right back into the pub. Gaara patted Sirius one more time before going back himself, appreciating the gesture, however mocking, of Sirius giving him one of his precious rabbits. Sirius barked and then ran off into the night, presumably back to the shack where he could try and get warm. Gaara walked inside, also enjoying getting out of the freezing cold, and went promptly to the bathroom to wash his hands of the contaminant of smelly dog and dead rabbit. As he let himself back into the private function room, he found Draco telling a story about the time he had ruined all of the good linen before his 6th birthday party and all of the trouble he had gotten into. Luna was the first to notice his re-entry. "Oh, we were just telling stories of our past birthdays." Draco, who had been interrupted before he could finish his own story, cutting out a large portion of physical retribution for his carelessness, was a little put out when she suggested Gaara tell a story now. Gaara thought for a moment, as anyone who knew him would say he did whenever he was about to share some detail of his past, before he nodded minutely and summoned his sand. "I have only celebrated one birthday before this, last year. My brother and sister cooked food and told stories, like tonight. It was nice." "Hold on a minute there, Gaara, did you say that you've never had a birthday before?" Lupin asked. "No, no one was thankful I was alive until last year." The blank, matter-of-fact expression on Gaara's face would have inspired pity in any group that didn't include a recently self-hating aristocrat, a chronically lonely, closeted werewolf, and a girl who had witnessed her own mother's death and was regularly called loony to her face. Nonetheless, it did dampen the mood a tad until Madame Rosematar barged into the room with a tray of drinks that looked far too interesting to be for the school group. Her smile dropped when she looked at the small gathering. "Oh, I am sorry my loves, I thought you were the bachelor party next door." "Not to worry." As she bustled back out of the door, Lupin jumped up and grabbed the rather large glass of fire whiskey off of the tray without her even noticing, sitting back with a quiet sigh. None of the other partygoers wanted to question aloud the wisdom of a teacher openly stealing and drinking alcohol in front of the 3 children he was supposed to be watching, and guarding from the big bad Mr. Sirius Black who, at the particular moment, had just arrived at the Shrieking Shack and was scratching himself behind the ear with his foot. Luna was just finishing her story about her 7th birthday, which had been very happy since she actually had guests come to it, when Lupin was coming to the end of his drink. As it turned out, Remus Lupin was a bit of a lightweight, not that he would ever admit to such an masculine weakness. Still, none of the minors complained. Gaara in no way considered himself a child in need to a chaperone, so as an adult he took no issue with looking after his friend. Luna didn't mind either, though no one would be able to tell why. She just didn't seem to feel unsafe in the slightest. Draco, who once upon a time would have called for a government investigation of Hogwarts at the first inkling of a professor who partook let alone to excess in front of his charges, but now Draco had stopped caring about a lot of things. Besides their individual damages, the 3 teenagers easily forgave the unacceptable behavior since the otherwise somber and, sporadically, professional professor had lightened up considerably with the application of alcohol. It was both a relief to see him loosen up and funny to watch it happen. Lupin's inebriation led to a few stories of the man's own, about his and his friends' various birthday exploits, including the infamous Sirius Black. Gaara quite liked seeing the uptight man finally let loose, and as his state progressed, Luna continued to be unfazed by her professor's drunken state and actually found his tales funny. Draco's reaction, on the other hand, varied from disgust, more at the story's content than any judgment he might level at the drunk teacher, to embarrassed anger when Lupin started telling the story of how Sirius had decided the perfect gift for first-year James' birthday would be all of Lucius Malfoy's underwear. The previous Malfoy scion had been pompous beyond belief from the start, and had become a pain in the rear for every Gryffindor since he was made head boy by the time the Marauders had started at Hogwarts. While not the devoted son he once was, Draco still had to make a harsh remark about the fact that both of the participants in the story had become either a convicted criminal or, worse yet, Potter's father. Actually, Draco, I was the one who distracted your father for the evening while Sirius stole all of his undergarments, and a good deal of his homework as well now that I think about it. Lupin cackled. Gaara couldn't wait to tell Sirius about witnessing Lupin's infantile alcohol tolerance. I think we should call it an evening since we all have classes tomorrow. Gaara wrote, standing to help Lupin to the fireplace. Yes, I suppose you are right. It's a shame though. Professor Lupin tells some very funny stories. Luna said. Thank you, Draco. Lupin said, looking at Luna. Draco led the way to the fireplace, having been given permission to flew back into Dumbledore's office, even in the night. Flew over and check if Dumbledore is there. Gaara spelled out, supporting Lupin's weight with apparent ease. He really was a lightweight, in both meanings. What? Why? Draco demanded. I don't wish to parade a drunk teacher in front of his boss. Satisfied, Draco went ahead and confirmed that the coast was clear, Dumbledore clearly having trusted Lupin to escort his charges back to school after the headmaster had gone to sleep. Come on through, but be quiet. The three remaining in the hogshead had to cram into the fireplace together since one was too drunk to command the flue and Gaara didn't feel like getting left behind. All too soon, they were thrown out in Dumbledore's office and quietly letting themselves out through the door with the hope that the crash the trio had sounded off hadn't awoken the slumbering wizard. Gaara headed towards Lupin's quarters while Draco escorted Luna to the nearby Ravenclaw Tower's entrance. When they were ascending the small staircase at the back of the Dada classroom, towards Remus' suite, the man piped up after having gone through a series of short naps on the way. Happy birthday, Lily. Gaara did not know which he resented more, the birthday sentiment forced on him, the hated and all too familiar nickname, or that his friend and trusted teacher was drunk. Still, Gaara would let the latter slide this time since he knew Lupin had his own troubles. For whatever reason, the kind and outgoing man had been alone most of his life before and after his time in Hogwarts, so being invited to a party must have been strange and upsetting. Not that Gaara could relate at all. He dumped Lupin on his bed and made his way to his own bed, stopping by the kitchens on the way to ask a nervous elf, already starting on breakfast, to send a wake-up call for Remus before his classes started for the day. With any luck, no one but those present at the party would ever know that Remus had been so irresponsible. Just as long as the man didn't start up drinking like Professor Trelawney. The Quidditch game was dry this time around, which was about the only positive word to be said about the late January weather. At least when there was rain they could huddle under shelter and their feet wouldn't need to be shifted every few minutes for fear of freezing to the ground. Gaara was dangerously close to tearing off a little of the stadium and starting a little fire in the sand igloo he had constructed. The heavy sand structure, sat atop one of the watching towers, was surrounded by 24 perturbed wizards who didn't appreciate the space Gaara was taking up with his ridiculous spell. They might have started up again with those annoying complaints if Gaara did actually start a fire in there. That, and since Padfoot was also cramped into the bubble of sand, they would have needed an extension before they could start adding amenities. They were lucky enough to be seated at the front of the viewing box, so they could have an open viewing window without fear of anyone peering in and spotting the shaggy black dog sat with Hogwarts resident sociopath. It had been very entertaining, explaining to Sirius the method he planned to employ to sneak the dog into the stadium, right past the Dementors, the Aurors, and the professors. He had coated himself in a thicker than usual layer of his sand to free up room inside of his gourd, where had crammed the large dog, and sealed it back up. Of all the ways anybody could have guessed Sirius Black might sneak into the school Quidditch match of the year, Gaara doubted any of them could have possibly imagined the man would have been shoved into a cramped gourd filled the rest of the way with sand and carried on the back on a 14-year-old waif of a student. That train of thought brought up an uncomfortable truth that distracted him entirely from the first 10 minutes of the match, so caught up in his depressed obsessive musings. He was easily the shortest boy in their year now, his already compact frame having been overtaken by even those boys whose birthdays fell in the summer. The number of girls shorter than him in their age bracket was fast declining as well. It was a sore point that Gaara had not grown a millimeter since he had started in September, and Draco, Sirius and Remus had learned not to bring it up, even in good fun. Call him Lily, mock his spellcasting or strange cultural ways, but mention any height-related topic at one's own peril. He was only drawn out of his internal ravings when his idiot companion started barking, a doggy way of cheering Harry along as he dodged bludgers left and right. Gaara slapped him on the nose, as he understood was the way to discipline a dumb, disobedient hound. Somehow, even knowing it was the incorrigible escapee inside, it didn't feel right slapping a dog around the back of the head. The game was intense from the start, as far as Gaara understood the game. There was no time for the players to sit around waiting for the snitch or the quaffle to go to them. They were chasing the various balls all over the sky from the moment the whistle blew. What would have otherwise been an impressive game was even more intense thanks to the addition of the Seekers both riding their new firebolts. By the time the bludgers came near either of them, they were at the other side of the stadium. And still, each time Draco checked Harry or Slytherin overtook Gryffindor in points, Sirius would turn his snout to Gaara and showcase something Gaara refused to describe as a look of derision. Draco kept Harry busy for a long while as the other players waged their desperate battle for points, their firebolts shortening the skill gap between the two players. Both sides were desperate for victory in this match since the pressure had only mounted since their previous attempt had ended in a draw. In short, it was a battle for honor, or so Draco had said repeatedly over the past month and a half. Gaara wasn't sure Draco knew what that word meant. All in all, though, at least it was an energetic game, which it occurred to Gaara might have been to ward off the cold. It was bad enough in his little sand cottage with another warm body to heat the place. He didn't want to think how could the players must be suspended in the freezing wind with nothing but their heating charms to ward off the hypothermia. Slytherin had reached a spectacular 70-point lead when the whistle blew and everyone looked around wondering why the match had been paused, only to find Madam Hooch hovering by Harry, the golden snitch in his outstretched hand. Apparently in all of the frantic zooming, Harry had snatched the snitch out of the sky, while Draco was floating at the other side of the stadium, having overshot it by 100 meters in a couple of seconds. Gaara's hand shot out to clamp over Sirius' snout as soon as he spied Harry with the snitch, preempting the howl that then tried to worm its way out of Sirius' forcibly shut mouth. The dog whined and Gaara let go, letting him pant and wag his tail happily, letting out a few excited but quiet hoofs. Gaara would have liked to have been able to stay and offer some emotional support for Draco after he had lost the important match, but he had to sneak Sirius back out into the wilderness. Well, he wouldn't have liked it, but he felt he should have been there to do it. Nonetheless, his duty to keep Sirius out of Azkaban for now. Emotional crap later. Much later. That said, now he had to deal with the unbearably smug dog-turned-man. One squeeze and he would be carrying dog slush rather than the man who drive him insane for the next few weeks, inside of his gourd. It would be so very easy. He dumped the dog out into the shack before turning and leaving immediately, not waiting to hear whatever Sirius had been howling in dog form all along. It was a long walk back into the school grounds and he had Dementors to slaughter. He actually didn't know what he would do if he managed to kill all of those ugly wraiths. Maybe go after those big spiders. When Gaara got back to his room, he had to wonder whether being around Sirius would have been as hellish as trying to comfort Draco after he had lost Slither in the pivotal match against their hated rivals. He refused to leave his room for 2 days, which was conveniently over the weekend, before Gaara got bored and decided to act. Draco had been wallowing in self-pity and avoiding the inevitable scorn he was to receive from his housemates when Gaara re-entered their room carrying something wrapped in cloth. He didn't pay it much mind, contemplating whether he could persuade his parents to transfer him to Durmstrang. Better that than face his house, who already had their doubts about his position. He hadn't heard anyone call him a blood traitor yet, but he imagined there were whispers. He was about to say some harsh and unwarranted things to his roommate, when Gaara pulled the house cup out of his extra cloak. Draco blinked slowly, set his head back down on his pillow, and thought. What? Draco jumped back up from his bed at speeds that might have won him the Quidditch match had he been so motivated at the time. What are you doing with that? Where did you even get the house cup? Gaara looked down at the shiny trophy and wondered if he had misstepped somewhere along the line. The trophy room. Gaara, you can't just steal it. Draco couldn't believe he was still surprised by his friend's shenanigans. You don't want it. Just put it back before someone notices it's missing. Gaara could never have guessed that his life would devolve into him marking time with the lunar calendar and the humiliating and dangerous transformations that accompanied it. He was fortunate that it drew no untoward attention to keep careful track of the moon's waxing and waning, their astronomy classes providing the perfect excuse. He had decided that the continuing freezing weather and brief moments of nudity out in the open winter air were good enough reasons to run the risk of transforming in the castle again. Also, he had realized how terrifying the thought of Sirius discovering his fluffy form was. How much of a kick would that man-child get out his debilitating peculiarity? The endless mockery and teasing, the animal nickname he was sure to receive. Then again, he supposed any nickname based on his mini-demon tanuki form would be better than Lily. The final reason he had decided to take the enormous risk was that it looked like it was going to rain that night and he didn't feel like getting soaking wet in either of his bodies. His clothes were uncomfortable enough. Having been left in the biting cold all night, it didn't bear thinking about being caught in a downpour. Of course, should the opportunity arise to run out in the open, if the rain held off, Gaara would enjoy a bit of fresh air around the perimeter of the castle. The only danger there being Hagrid, and he could hear the oath coming from a mile off with his human ears. So there was no chance whatsoever that the half-giant would be sneaking up on him with his sensitive, and pointy, animal ears. The transformation was quick and painless after the moon had risen, so Gaara picked up his discarded clothes and hid them under a desk in the abandoned classroom and settled down with his book until the students disappeared for the evening. The winter evenings were long and frustrating for the nocturnal creatures of the castle, but Gaara was experienced in killing time, among other things, so he had prepared for his weight with a heavy book. When he was free to roam, he took pleasure in the sounds of clicking his claws made on the polished stone floor, as well as the feel of the air against his fur when he managed to get up to full speed in the wide corridors. He ran all about the school, having a few close calls with the staff patrolling the corridors before they too turned in for the night, and then he moved outside between showers to enjoy the night air properly. He also took a few moments out of his busy schedule to go and harass the man chickens in the school coops, which did not look delicious. It was somehow hilarious watching the poultry getting flustered, yet another animal predilection he didn't plan to dwell on. It was as he had finished tormenting the otherwise affectionate birds that he turned back around to return to the castle and noticed that he was floating about a foot off of the ground. He was being levitated. How undignified. He turned about in the air frantically, hoping to break free of the magical hold somehow, or at least catch a glimpse of who had caught him. And catch a glimpse he did. Of all the people, he supposed it could have been worse considering all of his enemies in this world, but nonetheless, seeing Luna stood there with her wand controlling his movement was not a great comfort. The second year was smiling excitedly, even more than she had at his birthday party, as she drew his twisting and fidgeting body towards her. Luna had been waiting for the fluffy creature all night because she had worked out that he appeared on the full moon, but last month she hadn't been at the castle to search for the fascinating and adorable animal. She dropped Gaara into her waiting arms and held on tightly under his armpits as he squirmed to get free. He might have been able to escape, but he didn't know if he could get her to release him without hurting her with his tail or claws, and then he didn't know if he could run away fast enough to avoid any subsequent spells. For the moment, he would have to bide his time. With that in mind, he relaxed and hung limply in her arms, feeling even more ridiculous than he imagined her looked. He was a proud shinobi, he housed a demon in his body, he had killed hundreds of men, women and children, and now he was a furry tanuki being carried by a 13-year-old girl like some stray pup. And Draco questioned why he had anger issues. "I've been trying to find you since November, you see. You're very fast when you get running, but you were quite distracted with those chickens, weren't you?" Luna chatted inanely, as he was wont to do at all times. She totally ignored any bouts of struggling or stalling that the wild animal in her arms might go through as she walked. It further irked the seasoned warrior that Luna was able to carry him up flight after flight of stairs without any real strain. He knew it wasn't his own body, but it still smarted that his size was so slight. "I have 2 friends with red hair, like the fur on your head." "Well, I have 2 friends overall, I suppose. Except if you counted Draco Malfoy, but I don't think he likes me very much." "No, I have Ginny Weasley and Gaara. He doesn't have a surname, I don't think." She had continued upwards the whole time, towards Ravenclaw Tower, if Gaara's guesses were correct. He would wait for her to put him down and then make a run for it. "I went to Draco's Christmas party, mind you, but that was just because Gaara asked. It would have been nice if Ginny could have come, but I don't know if she would have liked Draco's house. Draco's father tried to set a rabbit heliopath on her once, on the order of the Minister for Magic, but she was saved by a king house elf and Harry Potter. She had answered the baffling riddle to enter her house and walked on up the stairs to her bedroom. It struck Gaara as somewhat unfair that, despite being quite a bit smaller than the Slytherin rooms, the Ravenclaws were given single rooms to themselves. Maybe it addressed the house's specific needs, with the claws studying on their own, The Snakes building a few important alliances, the Gryffindors building teams, and the Puffs. Maybe Rowena Ravenclaw had just had first pick of areas of the castle. What Gaara had failed to account for in his terribly clever plan of escape was that as soon as he was dumped onto Luna's bed, she had quickly walked back to her bedroom door and locked it. It was only a simple latch, but Gaara's big puffy paw digits would struggle immensely to unlatch it and get out all before Luna had time to stop him. Plan B it was then. Wait for her to fall asleep. At least she didn't seem to have any plans to torture him or, worse, play games with him. If he heard the word fetch he might have reconsidered his non-violence. She would eventually fall asleep, being only 13 and having school the next morning, but until then he would have to suffer through her inane prattling which he could normally run away from after he got tired of it. I asked Professor Flitwick for a lock on my door after I kept losing all of my school books. I always got them back but it was very time-consuming trying to find them all. I got something for you over the break. I think I put it in here somewhere. Luna had started rummaging through her trunk. With his captor distracted for the moment, Gaara snuck towards the door and tried for the latch but it soon became obvious he was going to need to stand on something to reach the lock. You must be very intelligent to know how to unlock a door. I'm still not sure what you are though. You can't speak, can you? If only. Gaara thought as he stared at her, caught red-handed. Ah, there it is. She pulled out a hairbrush with very fine bristles. Come here she said, patting the bed, but when the fluffy canid made no move, she added please. With an all too human sigh, he trudged forward to the bed and resigned himself to the further belittling of his dignity. This world had been humbling for the strongest Shinobi in Suna, if nothing else. He settled himself in her lap and wondered if it was entirely appropriate for a 14-year-old boy to be sat in bed with a 13-year-old girl past midnight. Then again, considering who they were and the undeniably exceptional circumstances, he didn't think there was anything inappropriate going on other than her desire to brush his fur. She talked endlessly as she brushed his fur and he thought about his latest Dada assignment. It was the height of boredom, barring the small level of intrigue seeing the brush work away at his tail. The thing was 90% hair and yet the brush only straightened the top layers. She had hugged him like a stuffed animal after she had finished the brushing and had even scratched him behind the ear, which he did not like. Liar. Luna eventually told him that she had always wanted a pet, but her father had said she had to discover a new animal if she wanted it. He honestly hadn't expected her to, not until she had finished school at least. She had even taken a strip of blue cloth and tied it into a bow around his neck. At least it wasn't a dog collar, he told himself. She continued to babble about her dreams of pet ownership, and told him all about how he would have a comfy bed in her room and fresh lamb for dinner. She soon tired herself out and fell asleep. As Gaara extracted himself from her clutches, he wondered whether he should re-evaluate his friendship with the girl since she was obviously insane. Although, he guessed it wasn't as strange from her perspective since he was an animal and not her friend with an animal's body. Either way, he would look into buying her a stuffed animal whenever her birthday was, anything to keep her away from him during full moons in future. He piled a couple of books up to reach the lock before excusing himself from the room. He still had a few hours before dawn, but after the harrowing night of captivity, he would be content to sit the classroom where his clothes were and continue reading his book. When the sun indeed began to rise, Gaara assessed his evening. It had been a trying and annoying night, but at least he had managed to escape without any damage or questions. It was only when the sun had risen and he was back in his own body that Gaara remembered the blue bow still tied around his neck. What he had not expected, as he tried to pull the thing off, was that Luna had had the foresight to spell the thing on her new animal friend so that it wasn't pulled off accidentally. Gaara tugged and pulled at the material, but for all of his immense strength the thing wouldn't budge. Even his kunai couldn't cut the thin material, which meant that nothing short of magic would relieve him of this latest. Even the word humiliation didn't capture the feeling. He considered using his wand, but somehow pointing his wand at his own neck set off his own survival instincts. The other option would be showing the bow to someone else like Draco. So, it was going to be staying for a while. He tied his hitayet around his neck and got fully dressed. On his way to the Great Hall for breakfast, he destroyed a number of suits of armor and hastily evacuated paintings, and Draco noted that Gaara seemed to be in a particularly foul mood that morning, though he couldn't guess why. Then again, it was anybody's guess what Gaara did on the many nights he went missing, but usually it seemed to alleviate stress. Gaara noticed that Luna seemed to have been crying when she showed up in the Great Hall. Ginny went and comforted to the grief-stricken girl, which meant Gaara had no compulsion to be anywhere near his kidnapper. That evening, as Gaara was getting ready for bed and coughing his larynx up, and Draco was finishing up his potions homework, he thought, just for a moment, that he heard an almost inaudible owl come from the other side of the room. He turned, but it was only Gaara there, looking wide-eyed as he sometimes tended to and miming words. He must have been hearing things.
Well, that's the ending of that chapter. I do hope you enjoy this video. If you like to see more, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment down below. Until next time.